Powerful men think they own the world, that their wealth, their influence, their status make them untouchable. But what happens when one of them picks a fight with the wrong person? A wealthy businessman, Martin Keaton, had spent years getting what he wanted, crushing anyone who stood in his way. So when he saw a homeless man in one of his luxury properties, he didn't think twice. He called the police. He filed a lawsuit, and he expected to win. But there was one problem. This wasn't just any homeless man. And when the truth came out, Martin Keaton's entire world collapsed. This is the story of a corporate giant who thought he had all the power, only to be brought to his knees by the one person he never saw coming. Who was the mysterious man at the center of this case? How did he turn the courtroom against Keaton? And in the end, who really walked away victorious? Stick around, because this story is one of the greatest reversals of power you will ever hear. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. Now let's get into it. The courtroom was packed. People whispered among themselves, glancing toward the defendant's table, where a man in tattered clothes sat hunched over. They looked out of place, completely unfitting for the setting. His long, unkempt hair was streaked with gray. His wrinkled coat had seen better days. His shoes were worn to the soles, and his hands were rough, cracked, and covered in dirt. He looked like a man who had been living on the streets for years. And today, he was on trial. A wealthy businessman, Martin Keaton, sat at the plaintiff's table, looking disgusted. Keaton was the owner of several properties in the city, including a luxury apartment building. And he had one clear goal today: to have this homeless man thrown in prison. Keaton's lawyer, Harold Briggs, stood confidently. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and commanding, "the case today is simple." He gestured toward the disheveled man at the defendant's table. This man, known only as Jack Carter, was found trespassing in one of my client's properties. Keaton nodded along, arms crossed. Briggs continued. He was caught sleeping in the lobby of a luxury apartment complex, refusing to leave, frightening the tenants, and violating private property laws. Keaton leaned forward. "He belongs in jail," he muttered. The courtroom murmured in agreement. Briggs turned toward the defense table. "Your Honor, this is an open-and shut case. This man has no home, no employment, and no legal right to be on that property. We demand the maximum sentence." Judge Eleanor Wright, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, turned to the defense attorney, a young, nervous-looking lawyer named David Cole. "Mr. Cole," Judge Wright said, "how does your client plead?" David stood up quickly, adjusting his tie. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. Keaton scoffed. "Unbelievable," he muttered. The homeless man, Jack Carter, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the table. Judge Wright nodded. "Proceed with opening arguments." And just like that, the trial began. As the trial got underway, the jury couldn't help but stare at Jack Carter. Everything about him screamed guilty. His dirty coat, his unshaven face, the way he sat silently, barely reacting to anything. He didn't look like someone who had a strong defense. Briggs walked in front of the jury, speaking confidently. "This is about the law," he said, "not sympathy." He pointed toward Jack Carter. "This man has been arrested before. Loitering, vagrancy, trespassing. He is a repeat offender." Some of the jurors nodded. Briggs continued. "And my client, Mr. Keaton? He provides housing for hundreds of people. He is a businessman, a property owner, and a respected member of this community." Keaton smiled, straightening his expensive suit. Briggs finished. "This case is not complicated. This man was in a place he did not belong, and now he must face the consequences." He turned toward the jury. "The prosecution rests." Judge Wright nodded. "Defense, you may proceed." David Cole stood up, flustered. Yes, Your Honor." He turned to Jack Carter. "Mr. Carter, would you like to make a statement?" Jack Carter finally lifted his head, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was deep, calm, and controlled. "I'd love to." The courtroom fell silent. Something about the way he spoke. It didn't match his appearance at all. Keaton narrowed his eyes. And then, Jack Carter smiled. And everything changed. Jack Carter slowly stood up, adjusting his ragged coat. He walked to the center of the courtroom, moving with a strange confidence. Then he turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what do you see when you look at me?" Some jurors looked away. Others hesitated. Jack nodded. "You see a homeless man," he said. "You see someone who doesn't belong." He looked toward Keaton. "You see a problem," he added. Keaton's lawyer, Briggs, stood up. "Objection. This is irrelevant." Judge Wright raised a hand. "Overruled. I want to hear this." Briggs sat down, fuming. Jack Carter turned back to the jury. "But what if I told you," he said, his voice calm and steady, "that I own 3 properties in this city?" The courtroom erupted in whispers. Keaton's smug expression faded. David, his own lawyer, turned to him, stunned. Even Judge Wright's eyebrows raised slightly. Keaton leaned forward. "What?" he muttered. Jack Carter smiled. "That's right," he said. "I'm not homeless. I'm not a vagrant." He turned to the judge. "And, Your Honor, I'd like to introduce myself properly now." He straightened his posture, pulling off his ragged coat. "My name is John Carter." Keaton froze. "Jack." "No." John Carter turned toward him. "And I," he said smoothly, "am a retired federal judge." Boom. The courtroom exploded in gasps. Keaton's face drained of color. Briggs shot up from his seat. "Objection." "What kind of?" Judge Wright slammed her gavel. "Order." But it was too late. The entire case had just flipped upside down. And Keaton? He was about to lose everything. Keaton sat frozen, staring at John Carter. You're lying," he stammered. John smiled. "Would you like me to prove it?" He reached into his ragged coat and pulled out his judge's ID badge. He set on the table, and the entire courtroom fell silent. John Carter wasn't just some homeless man. He was a former federal judge. And now, he was about to destroy Keaton in court. The courtroom had fallen into a stunned silence. All eyes were locked on John Carter, the man who had just revealed that he wasn't homeless at all. He was a retired federal judge. And now, the man who had been on trial was about to take control of the courtroom. Martin Keaton sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, his face drained of color. His lawyer, Harold Briggs, whispered furiously to him. "Is he serious?" Briggs hissed. "Is this guy really a judge?" Keaton couldn't answer, because deep down, he knew the truth. And if John Carter was really a former federal judge, then Keaton had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Judge Eleanor Wright, who had remained composed up until now, leaned forward. "Mr. Carter," she said, choosing her words carefully, "can you confirm your previous occupation?" John Carter smiled. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I served as a federal judge for over 20 years. The jury gasped. Keaton gripped the edge of the table. John continued. "I retired 5 years ago," he said, "but I never truly left the legal world. I chose to live among the people society ignores." Briggs shot up. "Your Honor, this is a distraction. This man was caught trespassing. His past occupation is irrelevant." John Carter turned to Briggs, his calm gaze piercing. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Briggs," he said. "The law is what matters here." Then, slowly, he pulled a document from his coat pocket and set it on the table. A deed to a property. His property. John Carter turned back to Judge Wright. "And, Your Honor, I have legal proof that the building Mr. Keaton is suing me over." He tapped the document. "On a portion of it." Keaton's jaw dropped. Briggs froze. Judge Wright took the deed and examined it carefully. After a long moment, she looked up. "This is a legally binding property deed," she confirmed. Briggs stammered. That can't be." John Carter turned to the jury. "So let's be clear," he said smoothly. "I wasn't trespassing. I was on my own property." A wave of shock and murmurs swept through the courtroom. Keaton's entire case had just fallen apart. The jurors had already been skeptical of Keaton's lawsuit. Now, they were questioning everything. One juror, a middle-aged woman, leaned toward the others. "He was never homeless?" she whispered. Another juror, a young man, nodded. Keaton tried to have a property owner arrested for being in his own building. Keaton could see it happening. He was losing them. And the worst part? There was nothing he could do. John Carter adjusted his coat and walked to the center of the courtroom. "Mr. Keaton," he said, his voice steady, You claimed that I was frightening tenants in your luxury apartment complex. Keaton's hands clenched. Yes, he said through gritted teeth. John nodded. And can you provide a single-tenant complaint? Keaton hesitated. Briggs scrambled through their files, but they had nothing. Because there wasn't a complaint. John smirked. That's what I thought. Briggs quickly stood. Your Honor, we were under the impression that Mr. Carter was a homeless squatter. John raised a hand. So you assumed I didn't belong, he said. Without checking who actually owned the property? Briggs froze. The jury? They were watching Keaton closely now. John turned back to Judge Wright. Your Honor, I'd like to file a counterclaim against Mr. Keaton. Keaton's head snapped up. What? Judge Wright raised an eyebrow. On what grounds? John Carter smiled. For filing a fraudulent lawsuit against me. Briggs stumbled over his words. You can't be serious. John nodded. Quite serious. Keaton jumped to his feet. You can't sue me. I'm the one pressing charges. John turned to him, his expression calm but deadly. Not anymore. Briggs was scrambling. Keaton was losing his temper. The jury was leaning toward John Carter now. And Judge Wright? She wasn't impressed with Keaton anymore. Mr. Carter, she said, what exactly are you countersuing for? John folded his hands. I am seeking $500,000 in damages for wrongful litigation, defamation, and the emotional distress caused by Mr. Keaton's baseless accusations. Keaton's eyes bulged. 500,000? He sputtered. John shrugged. Seems fair. The jury nodded in agreement. And that's when Keaton realized the truth. This wasn't his trial anymore. It was his downfall. Keaton lost it. He stood up, pointing at John. This is a trick, he shouted. You set me up. John tilted his head. Oh, did I force you to file a lawsuit against a property owner? Keaton's face turned red. Briggs buried his head in his hands. Judge Wright banged her gavel. Order in the court. Keaton sat down, breathing heavily. Judge Wright exhaled. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she said, I believe this case has taken a significant turn. She turned to Keaton. Mr. Keaton, I suggest you strongly reconsider your legal position. Keaton's fists clenched. But he knew it. He had already lost. John Carter sat back down, watching Keaton break under pressure. His work here? Almost done. Briggs leaned toward Keaton. We need to settle now. Keaton gritted his teeth. No. Briggs stared at him. If we don't settle, you'll be the one paying $500,000. Keaton froze. The realization hit him like a truck. And across the courtroom, John Carter just smiled. Because he had played Keaton perfectly. And now, it was time for the final move. The courtroom was now a battlefield, and Martin Keaton was losing. For years, Keaton had used his money, influence, and legal connections to win every case he touched. But today, he was facing off against a retired federal judge. And for the first time in his entire life, he was on the wrong side of the law. Keaton's lawyer, Harold Briggs, was sweating. His client was cracking under pressure, and the jury could see it. He leaned in toward Keaton, whispering furiously. We need to settle. Keaton clenched his jaw. No, he muttered. Briggs hissed. If we don't, you'll be paying $500,000. Keaton's fists tightened. He wasn't going to let some disguised judge humiliate him in his own lawsuit. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, he said, forcing a smile, this is all a misunderstanding. I'd be happy to drop the charges if Mr. Carter does the same. The courtroom stirred. John Carter, sitting at the defense table, simply raised an eyebrow. Then he stood up. Your Honor, he said, his voice calm and authoritative. That sounds an awful lot like a man who knows he's about to lose. The jury chuckled. Keaton's face burned red. Judge Wright nodded. Mr. Carter, do you accept the withdrawal of charges? John smiled. No, Your Honor, he said smoothly. I want to proceed with my counter lawsuit. Keaton's head snapped up. What? John turned toward him, completely unbothered. I spent weeks being dragged through the legal system for no reason, Mr. Keaton, he said. You didn't care when you were the one pressing charges. So why should I? Keaton gritted his teeth. Briggs, his lawyer, sighed. Your Honor, we'd like to file a motion to dismiss, Briggs said quickly. John chuckled. Oh, now you want to dismiss something? He asked. Funny how that works. The jury laughed again. Keaton was losing control. He needed something to shift the power back. So, he snapped. Keaton stood up so fast his chair toppled over. "This is a joke," he shouted. "What do we even know he's really a judge?" John raised an eyebrow. Judge Wright sighed. "Mr. Keaton," she said firmly, "please sit down." But Keaton was past the point of logic. He pointed directly at John Carter. "You're a fraud," he yelled. "You're a liar." John's expression never changed. Cool, collected, in complete control. "Interesting claim," he said simply. "You're saying I lied about my credentials?" Keaton scoffed. "Of course," he spat. "This whole thing is a scam." John nodded slowly. Then he turned to Judge Wright. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to submit Exhibit B." The bailiff walked over with a thick file. Judge Wright opened it. Her eyes flickered with recognition. After a moment, she set the file down. "Mr. Carter's credentials have been verified," she said, her tone firm. "He is a retired federal judge with over 20 years on the bench." Keaton's heart dropped. John Carter tilted his head. "Anything else you'd like to say, Mr. Keaton?" Keaton's mouth opened and closed. For the first time in his entire life, he was speechless. The jurors had seen enough. They had watched Keaton unravel. They had watched John Carter remain calm, professional, and methodical. And now, they knew the truth. Keaton had filed a bogus lawsuit against a man who wasn't even trespassing. And then, he had humiliated himself in front of the entire courtroom. Juror number 4, a middle-aged woman, whispered to the others, "He's done." Juror number 6, a younger man, nodded. Carter played him like a fiddle. And just like that, Keaton had lost. Judge Wright turned to John Carter. "Mr. Carter, your counter-lawsuit requests $500,000 in damages for wrongful litigation and defamation." John nodded. "That's correct, Your Honor." Judge Wright turned to the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." Judge Wright nodded. "In the matter of Carter versus Keaton, how do you find the defendant?" The foreman glanced toward Keaton. Then, with no hesitation, he said, "We find in favor of John Carter." Keaton's face drained of color. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Keaton's lawyer, Briggs, immediately stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to file an appeal." Judge Wright held up a hand. "The jury has spoken." She turned toward Keaton. "You are hereby ordered to pay Mr. Carter $500,000 in damages." Keaton staggered backward. His entire fortune was about to take a massive hit. He looked toward his lawyer. But Briggs? He was already packing up his files. Because even he knew there was no saving Keaton now. As the courtroom emptied, Keaton sat at the plaintiff's table, motionless. People walked past him, whispering, laughing, shaking their heads. His reputation was ruined. His money was about to disappear. And the man he had tried to destroy had just walked away with $500,000. Across the room, John Carter shook hands with his lawyer, David Cole. David stared at him in awe. "You planned all of this, didn't you?" John smiled. "Keaton did it to himself," he said. "I just let him dig his own grave." David chuckled. "And what are you going to do with all that money?" John adjusted his coat. "Help people who actually need it," he said simply. Then, without another word, John Carter walked out of the courtroom, leaving Keaton in ruins. Martin Keaton sat in the now-empty courtroom, staring blankly at the table in front of him. The words still echoed in his head. "We find in favor of John Carter." The jury had spoken. The judge had ruled. And now, he was $500,000 poorer. His once untouchable reputation shattered. And the worst part? It was all his fault. By the time Keaton stepped outside, the courthouse was swarming with reporters. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in his face. Questions bombarded him from every direction. "Mr. Keaton, do you have a comment on your loss?" "Mr. Keaton, what will this lawsuit do to your real estate empire? Do you regret suing John Carter?" Keaton's jaw clenched. No, he wouldn't let them see him sweat. He adjusted his expensive, but now meaningless, suit, straightened his tie, and forced a smirk. "This isn't over," he said smoothly. Then he walked past them, pretending that his entire world wasn't crumbling around him. But the moment he got into his black luxury car and slammed the door shut, his hands started shaking. Because he knew the truth. It was over. Meanwhile, across the city, John Carter sat in a quiet cafe, sipping his coffee. Unlike Keaton, he had no reporters chasing him, no flashing cameras, no chaos, just peace. David Cole, his young lawyer, sat across from him, shaking his head in disbelief. "I still can't believe you pulled that off," David said, grinning. John smirked. Keaton played himself. David laughed. "You just sat there while he dug his own grave." John shrugged. "You learn a few things when you spend 20 years as a judge." David shook his head. "But why let him think you were homeless?" he asked. "You could have stopped this from the start." John set down his cup. "Because people like Keaton only respect power," he said. "And I wanted to show him what happens when you underestimate someone you think is beneath you." David nodded slowly. John glanced at his legal winnings notice, still sitting on the table. $500,000. It was a massive sum, but he didn't need it, and he already knew what he was going to do with it. The next morning, Keaton arrived at his real estate firm, expecting business as usual. Instead, he walked into a boardroom full of furious investors. The CEO, a stone-faced man in his 60s, gestured for Keaton to sit. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold. Keaton forced a smile. "Gentlemen, this is all being blown out of proper." "Enough," the CEO snapped. He tossed a newspaper onto the table. "Martin Keaton loses $500,000 in embarrassing courtroom defeat." Keaton swallowed hard. "This lawsuit has turned our firm into a laughingstock," one investor growled. Another investor folded his arms. "Clients are pulling out of deals because of this mess." Keaton clenched his fists. "This is just media hype. It'll die down." The CEO sighed. "We can't afford this kind of publicity, Keaton." Then he slid a document across the table. Keaton stared at it. It was a resignation letter. His own. He looked up. You're firing me?" The CEO's gaze was unforgiving. "Sign it," he said, "or we take this to the board, and you leave in even more disgrace." Keaton's hands shook with rage. But he knew. He had no choice. Slowly, he picked up the pen and signed away everything. Later that evening, John Carter walked into a homeless shelter, the same one he had volunteered at for years. The shelter director, Marion Lewis, greeted him with a smile. "John," she said, "I heard about the trial. Congratulations." John nodded, handing her an envelope. She took it confused. Then she opened it. Inside, a $500,000 donation check. Marianne's eyes widened. "John, is this from your case?" John smiled. "People assume the worst about the homeless, Marianne." He nodded toward the shelter. "Time to prove them wrong." Marianne's eyes filled with tears. "And John Carter?" He walked out of the shelter without looking back. Because for him, the money had never mattered. All he had wanted was to teach Martin Keaton a lesson. And now, that lesson was complete. That night, Martin Keaton sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline. His career was over. His money was disappearing. His power was gone. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing what it felt like to be powerless. He grabbed a glass of whiskey, downing it in one gulp. Then his phone rang. He picked it up, his voice tired. "Hello." A cold voice answered. "Keaton." He recognized it immediately. John Carter. Keaton sat up straight. "What do you want?" he snapped. John's voice was calm. "Just checking in," he said. "How's it feel?" Keaton gritted his teeth. "You think this is over?" John chuckled. "Oh, it's definitely over," he said. Keaton's fists clenched. "I'll rebuild," he growled. "I'll come back." John sighed. "I doubt it," he said. Keaton's breathing was heavy. John's voice dropped to a whisper. "You try to crush a man you thought was beneath you." A pause. "And now, Keaton?" Another pause. "You're the one at the bottom." Click. John hung up. And Keaton? He sat in his silent, empty penthouse, gripping his glass, realizing that, for the first time in his life, he had nothing left. Martin Keaton sat in his silent penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows across the empty room. He had spent years building his reputation, decades making powerful connections, a lifetime ensuring that he was always on top. And now, he was ruined. The next morning, Keaton's phone exploded with messages. But these weren't the messages he was used to. "You embarrassed yourself, Keaton. No one trusts you anymore. You were untouchable, and you threw it all away. You lost to a guy who looked homeless. You're a joke now. Keaton's hands shook with rage. But it wasn't just messages. It was everything. The investors pulled their money. His business associates cut ties. Even his personal friends distanced themselves. Because nobody wanted to be connected to a failure. Keaton had spent his entire life stepping on others. And now, the world was stepping on him. The next morning, Keaton's phone exploded with messages. But these weren't the messages he was used to. You embarrassed yourself, Keaton. No one trusts you anymore. You were untouchable, and you threw it all away. You lost a guy who looked homeless. You're a joke now. Keaton's hands shook with rage. But it wasn't just messages. It was everything. The investors pulled their money. His business associates cut ties. Even his personal friends distanced themselves. Because nobody wanted to be connected to a failure. Keaton had spent his entire life stepping on others. And now, the world was stepping on him. Across the city, John Carter sat at a modest cafe, enjoying his usual black coffee. No cámaras, no reporters, no spotlights, just peace. David Cole, his young lawyer, sat across from him, shaking his head. You know, David said, you could have kept the money. John smiled. I didn't need it. David chuckled. Most people wouldn't give away $500,000. John shrugged. I didn't want revenge, David. I wanted justice. David leaned back, thinking. Keaton thought you were nobody, he said. But you turn out to be the most dangerous person he's ever met. John chuckled. The most dangerous man in the room, he said, is the one who has nothing to lose. Keaton wasn't going to go down without a fight. Even after losing the lawsuit, even after his reputation crumbled, he still had money. So he did what he did best. He tried to buy his way back. He called old business partners, promising them new opportunities. They all refused. He reached out to influential friends, trying to repair his public image. They all ignored him. He even tried hiring a PR firm to clean up his reputation. They took his money. But nothing changed, because Martin Keaton wasn't powerful anymore. And without power, he was just another failed businessman. 2 months after the trial, Keaton received a final letter from the bank. It was a foreclosure notice. His penthouse, gone. His remaining assets, seized. His accounts, frozen. The same banks that had once financed his empire had now turned against him. And just like that, the man who had once controlled real estate empires was now homeless. John Carter had heard the news. Keaton had lost everything. His company, his wealth, his power gone. David Cole looked at John over their usual coffee. So what now? David asked. Keaton's finished. You won. John took a sip of his coffee. Then he smiled. No, he said. He lost. David grinned. And you? John chuckled. I just walked away. And that was the biggest victory of all. Martin Keaton had once stood at the top. A man of power. A man of wealth. A man who believed the world belonged to him. Now, he had nothing. His company was gone. His penthouse was foreclosed. His bank accounts were empty. And for the first time in his life, he was just another man on the street. Keaton spent his first night without a home, sitting in a cheap motel room, staring at the peeling wallpaper. His expensive suit was now wrinkled. His custom-made shoes were scuffed. His phone? Silent. The business partners who once praised him wouldn't return his calls. The lawyers who once protected him had moved on to bigger clients. And the reporters who once covered his real estate deals, they were now writing stories about his downfall. He had spent years crushing people beneath him, and now he was the one being crushed. Meanwhile, John Carter lives without regret. Across the city, John Carter sat in his modest apartment, reading the news. Keaton's name was everywhere. Former real estate tycoon declares bankruptcy. Martin Keaton loses everything after courtroom defeat. From billionaire to broke. The unbelievable fall of Martin Keaton. John Carter took a sip of coffee, shaking his head. David Cole, his lawyer, sat across from him. I almost feel bad for him, David admitted. John raised an eyebrow. Almost. David smirked. Yeah. Then I remember he tried to put you in jail. John chuckled. That does tend to erase sympathy. David leaned forward. So be honest. Do you feel vindicated? John thought about it. Then he shook his head. No, he said, because this was never about revenge. David blinked. Then what was it about? John smiled. Balance. Because the truth was, John Carter didn't ruin Keaton. Keaton ruined himself. And justice had simply played out the way it was meant to. Keaton's final desperate move. Keaton refused to accept his fate. He wasn't meant to be broke. He wasn't meant to be powerless. And he sure as hell wasn't meant to fade into obscurity. So, he did what he had always done. He schemed. Late at night, in his rented motel room, Keaton scribbled notes on a napkin. Find investor. Rebuild reputation. Take back what was mine. It wasn't over. Not yet. He would reclaim his power. He would restore his empire. And most of all, he would make John Carter pay. Or so he thought. Keaton was sitting in a diner, staring at his dwindling bank balance, when a shadow fell across his table. He looked up and froze. John Carter stood over him, wearing a simple jacket, calm, in control. The man Keaton had once tried to destroy, now standing over him like a ghost. Keaton clenched his jaw. What do you want? John took a seat across from him. I heard you were trying to make a comeback, John said smoothly. Keaton smirked. Why? You scared? John chuckled. Of you? He shook his head. Not even a little. Keaton gritted his teeth. I'm not done, he growled. John tilted his head. Yes, you are. Keaton's fists clenched. I'll rebuild. John leaned forward. Go ahead, he said. But let me tell you something, Keaton. Keaton stared at him. John's voice dropped to a whisper. The world has already moved on. Keaton's smirk faltered. John stood up, tossing a few dollars on the table for Keaton's coffee. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Keaton in silence. And in that moment, Martin Keaton finally understood. His time was over.
Martin Keaton had once stood at the top, a man of power, a man of wealth, a man who believed the world belonged to him. Now, he had nothing. His company was gone. His penthouse was foreclosed. His bank accounts were empty. And for the first time in his life, he was just another man on the street. Keaton spent his first night without a home, sitting in a cheap motel room, staring at the peeling wallpaper. His expensive suit was now wrinkled. His custom-made shoes were scuffed. His phone? Silent. The business partners who once praised him wouldn't return his calls. The lawyers who once protected him had moved on to bigger clients. And the reporters who once covered his real estate deals, they were now writing stories about his downfall. He had spent years crushing people beneath him, and now he was the one being crushed. Meanwhile, John Carter lives without regret. Across the city, John Carter sat in his modest apartment, reading the news. Keaton's name was everywhere. Former real estate tycoon declares bankruptcy. Martin Keaton loses everything after courtroom defeat. From billionaire to broke. The unbelievable fall of Martin Keaton. John Carter took a sip of coffee, shaking his head. David Cole, his lawyer, sat across from him. I almost feel bad for him, David admitted. John raised an eyebrow. Almost. David smirked. Yeah, then I remember he tried to put you in jail. John chuckled. That does tend to erase sympathy. David leaned forward. So be honest. Do you feel vindicated? John thought about it. Then he shook his head. No, he said, because this was never about revenge. David blinked. Then what was it about? John smiled. Balance. Because the truth was, John Carter didn't ruin Keaton. Keaton ruined himself. And justice had simply played out the way it was meant to. Keaton's final desperate move. Keaton refused to accept his fate. He wasn't meant to be broke. He wasn't meant to be powerless. And he sure as hell wasn't meant to fade into obscurity. So, he did what he had always done. He schemed. Late at night, in his rented motel room, Keaton scribbled notes on a napkin. Find an investor. Rebuild reputation. Take back what was mine. It wasn't over. Not yet. He would reclaim his power. He would restore his empire. And most of all, he would make John Carter pay. Or so he thought. Keaton was sitting in a diner, staring at his dwindling bank balance, when a shadow fell across his table. He looked up and froze. John Carter stood over him, wearing a simple jacket, calm, in control. The man Keaton had once tried to destroy, now standing over him like a ghost. Keaton clenched his jaw. What do you want? John took a seat across from him. I heard you were trying to make a comeback, John said smoothly. Keaton smirked. Why? You scared? John chuckled. Of you? He shook his head. Not even a little. Keaton gritted his teeth. I'm not done, he growled. John tilted his head. Yes, you are. Keaton's fists clenched. I'll rebuild. John leaned forward. Go ahead, he said. But let me tell you something, Keaton. Keaton stared at him. John's voice dropped to a whisper. The world has already moved on. Keaton's smirk faltered. John stood up, tossing a few dollars on the table for Keaton's coffee. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Keaton in silence. And in that moment, Martin Keaton finally understood. His time was over. For the first time in his life, Martin Keaton had nothing. No company, no money, no influence. He had spent decades building an empire, and in a matter of months, it had all crumbled. But the worst part? It wasn't taken from him. He destroyed it himself. Keaton had once been a powerful name in the real estate world. Now, he was a cautionary tale. How arrogance took down a real estate giant. Keaton versus Carter. The court case that changed everything. Where is Martin Keaton now? Spoiler, nowhere. Nobody respected him anymore. Nobody feared him. Nobody cared. And in the world he had once controlled, that was worse than being hated. The job he never thought he'd take. Months later, Keaton sat in the back office of a small real estate agency, staring at his new job contract. Position, junior property consultant. Salary, $52,000 a year. It was a fraction of what he had once made in a single week. But this was all he could get. The industry hadn't forgotten. Nobody wanted to work with a man who had been publicly humiliated. But Keaton? He was out of options. So he signed the contract. And just like that, the man who once owned skyscrapers was now filling out rental applications for middle-class clients. The fall was complete. Meanwhile, John Carter enjoys his peace. Across the city, John Carter sat at his usual quiet cafe, drinking his usual simple black coffee. The world had changed after the trial. People had started calling him the judge who taught a lesson. His story had inspired legal students, activists, and ordinary people who had been mistreated by the rich. But John? He didn't want fame. He just wanted to live simply. David Cole, his lawyer, sat across from him. You know, David said, stirring his coffee, you could have destroyed him completely. John smiled. I didn't need to. David frowned. Why not? John glanced out the window, watching the busy city streets. Then he said calmly, because I let him destroy himself. David nodded slowly. It was true. John Carter had never raised his voice, never played dirty, never used power for revenge. All he had done was let Keaton's own arrogance bring him down. And in the end, that was the worst punishment of all. One evening, Martin Keaton walked past his old penthouse building, the skyscraper he had once owned. It was still standing, still a symbol of power. But now, it belonged to someone else. Keaton stood on the sidewalk, staring up at it. His new work uniform felt itchy. His name meant nothing now. And for the first time, he understood something painfully simple. John Carter had never needed power to win, because real power was knowing when to walk away. Keaton took one last look at his past. Then he turned and walked into the shadows of the city, never to be heard from again.